let's talk about the two rules. If you haven't heard about them already, you're about to have a major breakthrough in your shooting. So I have two rules that I created, and I started this at the end of last year. I guess I figured out the way to explain it. So the two rules, okay? These are the two rules that give you permission to shoot in this sport. Really, it gives you permission to shoot in life. So it's going to change the way you shoot forever. Now, here's the problem with these two rules. They are the easiest rules to break because you break them every time we pull the trigger when we have a miss. So the two rules. Number one, what gives you permission to shoot? What gives you permission to pull the trigger? Sights. So what gives you permission to exit, reload, transition, shoot another shot? The trigger. Now, let's talk a little bit about it. And it's pretty simple. I'm going to give you a couple of examples out here so you can actually see what I'm talking about. So what gives you permission to pull the trigger is your sights. If you do not have your sights, you cannot pull the trigger. Let me rephrase that. You're not supposed to pull the trigger. That's why this is such a easy rule to break, because we do this all the time. I'll give you an easy example. How many times if you pulled the trigger on a draw and you didn't have your sights, you just yanked that trigger because you're supposed to pull the trigger quickly, because that's what we do on our draw, right? That's what everybody tells you. Pull the trigger as fast as you can, as soon as you can. Doesn't matter if you have your sights or not, because you're looking for that 1 second draw. Well, that's not the answer. Rule number two, how is it that if you have your sights, all right, here's how number one and number two work together. If you have your sights, you have permission to pull the trigger. Why are you not pulling the trigger if you've already had your sights? In other words, why are you over confirming your sights? You sit on the trigger, the target forever. You're just sitting there. Okay, I got it. Boom. Then the sights land and you're waiting, and then you pull it again. Here's where you really save most of your time in these two rules, okay? If you have a sight picture, it gives you permission to pull the trigger. If you are trigger prepped and you are ready to shoot, then you are going to instantly respond to those sights. Now, where you start to lose most of your time in this sport, guys, are transitions. So once I know I can pull the trigger, which what gives me permission to pull the trigger is rule number one, my sights. So once I've have my sights and I've pulled the trigger, I'm supposed to be leaving that target. What happens for most people is they get a third sight picture. So they get a 1, they get a 2, and then they reconfirm that they've had those sights because they're going to see a third sight picture, and then they leave. But the issue is you've already had permission to exit that target. I want you to think of it this way. Once you pull the trigger and the bullet is gone, you can no longer take it back. So why are you still waiting for the confirmation of the hit? So once you have permission, leave, get off the target, and move to the next position. This happens in movement. This happens in anything we do. I will give you a couple of examples of how I do it in movement, as well as how I do it while I'm shooting, okay? I'm going to also show you in this example, guys, how rule number one and rule number two will also allow you to understand where your misses come from, or even better yet, where your success comes from, okay? So let's get into this example. So we're going to start on steel first. I'm going to give you rule number one. Here we go. This is going to be rule number one. I'm not going to follow. I'm just going to pull the trigger as soon as I get the gun out. Here we go. So I shot low, pulled the trigger, didn't have sights. I had a little flash of sights, but it wasn't on the steel, okay? Now, so it's a 107. This is with sights. 112, but I have a hit. Sights. Remember, number one gave me permission to pull the trigger. Now let's look at it through transitions. This is without, okay? I'm going to transition from the left steel to the piece of paper. This is without any permission, okay? I'm just going to pull the trigger, and then I'm going to leave after I take a second sight picture, okay? So I'm not going to allow the trigger to give me permission, okay? Again, I'm going to do it the wrong way, okay? This is me just pulling the trigger and then moving whenever I feel like it. Here we go. All right, so my transition time was a 58, total time 94. Here we go. 58 split to that paper. This is me using the transition or the trigger pull to give me permission to transition to the paper. Here we go. So my total time was 58. I had a transition of 39 that time because I used the trigger to give me permission to move to the next target. Okay, remember, the trigger pull is what gave me permission to leave because I already had sights, which is rule number one. So then when I have rule number 1, it instantly allows me to pull the trigger. And once I pull the trigger, I can't take the bullet back. It's time to move to the next shot, next target. Okay, now I am going to go to the paper. And I'm going to give you guys an example of when I don't use number 1 and rule number 2 together. So I just want to double check to make sure I have no Charlies at all in the paper. So everything's alpha. I have a kind of a dead center alpha and a little bit higher A, but it's all in the A zone. All right, so here we go. Now I'm going to transition from the paper to the steel. All right, and what I want, I'm not even going to shoot at the steel. What I want you to see is when I have permission to pull the trigger, I leave the target. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to leave before I pull the trigger. So in other words, I'm not going to worry about my sights and I'm not going to worry about the rules. I'm just going to pull the trigger and then try to leave to get to the steel. So I'm going to take 2 shots at paper, okay? Here we go. So in other words, what that means is I'm going to leave on the second shot before I've actually pulled the trigger, okay? Here we go. Gun up this time. So right now, I already know I had a mic. I could see it when I pulled the trigger because I left way before I was supposed to. So I have a dead center alpha where the target was where I was pointed at it, and then I have a mic because I pulled off the target. So again, what I did is as soon as I pulled the trigger, I tried to leave as the gun was coming down, and then I pulled the trigger and I was off the target already. So my total time was a 39, okay? I had a .18 split, but a mic. All right, here we go. All right, so I moved on the second shot. Let's see what I had. But I left a little bit early. I didn't leave on the second shot, I left right before. So I had a dead center alpha, and then I had a Charlie because I pulled off of the target before, okay, before I pulled the trigger. I didn't have permission. So I had a 21 split that time. So I went from an 18, I think it was. Let's just double check it what it is. So I had an 18 split versus a 21 split, okay? So right now, just that little delay, but I still left early. I did not give myself permission to pull the trigger. All right, now I'm going to finish this, but I'm gonna shoot the steel, but I'm gonna wait to leave on that piece of paper until on the second trigger pull. So as the gun lifts, so it's boom, as it lifts, I'm gonna transition and shoot the steel. Here we go. So, 0.88 total time. I had a 0.30 transition to the steel, is what I had on that. So my first shot was a 16, my second shot was a 30, then it was a 42. So let me pick up the splits a little bit. I had all alphas. Let me pick up the splits a little bit, and then I'll show you what it looks like when I leave fast as I can on that piece of steel. Here we go. Oh, I just pulled the trigger too early. I didn't get my eyes on that steel before I pulled the trigger. I just yanked it as I got to it. So let me bring the target up so I can show you guys what happened here. So that transition that time was a 26, all right, a 26. All right, so we should be nice and focused on this target here. Let's talk a little bit about it. So this is when I left really early before I was ever pulling the trigger. So in other words, I pulled the trigger, and actually I'll give you a sound click here so you should be able to hear it. As I come to this target here, what I did is I pulled the first shot and then I left and then pulled the trigger. So I waited to pull that trigger, okay? So that right there is where I got the Charlie. This is actually what it sounded like earlier when I had the mic. I had shot 1 and then I clicked it out here or pulled the trigger out here because I left after shot number 1. This, I left while I was shooting shot number 2. So I didn't pull the trigger. I didn't actually pull the trigger. I pulled the trigger as I was exiting. So which means I didn't have permission to leave in the first place, okay? Now, let's talk about the last transition that I had, all right? It was one of my faster splits, so I just want to make sure that we keep it honest. I had a 26 split. Let's see, I had a 1-8, then an 18, and then a 26 to the steel. So I actually had an 18 was my second shot on this piece of paper. So I shot an 18 split and it was a 26 to that small mini steel, which I missed anyway, so it didn't matter how fast that was. That wasn't the goal, was to get there. It was just to kind of give you an example of me shooting in a rhythm. So let's talk about where both my hits landed on that last run. Both of them are sitting right here in a figure 8 on this target. So my first shot, obviously I better get an alpha. I'm pointing at the damn target, but my second shot, look where it landed, right on top of that other hole. And look how magically I don't have a delta or a Charlie or a Mike or anything else outside of that A zone because I waited for permission to leave the target. This is how important rule number 1 and rule number 2 are in this sport. If you follow those 2 simple rules and you make them mean something in your shooting, it'll change the way you shoot forever in this sport, in life, in self-defense, or in shooting in our game. It'll change the way you shoot forever. 2 things that happen with your shooting. Number 1, if you've pulled the trigger and you had a mic, okay? There's 2 things that solve that problem, or how you can figure it out, and this is why these rules are so important to me. 1, if you've pulled the trigger and you had your sights, that means you didn't pull the trigger when you were supposed to. That means you waited to pull the trigger, because if your sights are on the target, you already have permission to pull the trigger and you didn't. Number 2, the other way you're gonna figure out how your misses are happening is if you don't have your sights and you pulled the trigger anyway. So those 2 things, all you have to do is go back and forth and figure it out. Was it sights, trigger, trigger, sights, sights, trigger? And if you follow those 2 rules and you start to use those 2 simple rules, it'll change the way you shoot forever. All right, guys, if you have any questions, hit me up in those comments and I'll see you on the range.